Ethan Cole thought he had finally found something worth holding on to, and that single thought would come back to haunt him before the night was even over. The date had gone better than he dared to hope. Rain tapped softly against the windows of the small Italian place on Hawthorne Street. Candlelight flickered between them, and for 3 uninterrupted hours he forgot every reason he had to feel guarded around another person. Her name was Claire, and she laughed at the right moments, asked questions like she actually wanted the answers, and when she reached across the table to touch his hand, something in his chest loosened that had been tight for years. He walked home through the wet Portland streets with his collar turned up and a grin he couldn't shake, replaying her laugh over and over like a song stuck in his head. The old brick building where he rented his apartment always smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, and the lobby lights were dimmer than usual that night, giving the whole space a hushed, waiting quality. His landlady, Eleanor Whitfield, was exactly where she always was at that hour, tucked into the worn green armchair by the mailboxes with a paperback open on her lap. She was 71, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and had lived in that building longer than anyone could remember. In the 18 months Ethan had lived there, she had brought him soup when he was sick, scolded him for skipping meals, and once sat with him for an entire evening after his father passed, saying nothing at all, just being present. He genuinely loved her, the way you love a grandmother you never expected to have. "You're home late," she said, not looking up right away. "Yeah." He couldn't keep the smile off his face. "I just got back from a date." For a moment she didn't respond. Then, slowly, she closed the book. The gesture was small, but something about it made the hallway feel colder. When she finally looked up, the warmth that always lived in her expression had drained out of it, replaced by something Ethan couldn't name, something between grief and fear. "She doesn't love you like I do," Eleanor said quietly. The words landed strangely, like a sentence spoken in the wrong language. Ethan laughed, waiting for the punchline, waiting for her to soften and tell him she was only teasing an old woman's way of saying she'd miss having him around if things got serious. But she didn't laugh. She didn't even blink. She simply held his gaze with an intensity that made the back of his neck prickle, and then she picked the book back up, as if the conversation had already ended. He stood there a second too long, unsure whether to ask her to explain herself or pretend the whole exchange hadn't happened. In the end, he mumbled a good night and took the stairs 2 at a time. Claire's laugh from earlier now replaced entirely by 5 strange words looping endlessly in his mind. He didn't sleep well. He kept turning the sentence over like a stone in his pocket, examining it from every angle. Was she confused? Was this the beginning of something worse, a sign of memory slipping that he hadn't noticed before? Or was there something else buried underneath it, something she meant with complete clarity and had simply never said out loud until tonight? By morning, he had convinced himself it was nothing, some odd flicker of an old woman's mood. By noon, sitting at his desk, unable to focus on a single email, he knew that wasn't true. There had been nothing confused about the way she'd looked at him. She had meant every word. He tried mentioning it to a coworker over lunch, hoping saying it out loud might shrink it down to something manageable. His coworker just laughed and told him landladies get attached to good tenants, that's all. Nothing to lose sleep over. But Ethan didn't laugh along. He kept picturing the exact moment her smile had disappeared, the way her hands had gone still on the book, the way her voice had dropped almost to a whisper before she said those 5 words, as though she'd been holding them in for a very long time and finally let them slip. Whatever this was, it wasn't nothing. He could feel that much in his bones, and the feeling only sharpened as the day wore on. That evening, he caught himself standing outside her door before he even realized he'd walked there, keys still in his hand, coat still buttoned. He almost turned around twice. Some instinct told him that whatever answer waited on the other side of that door would change something between them, and there was no way to knock and take the question back afterward. The next 2 days crawled by. Claire texted him twice, and both times he found himself staring at his phone instead of answering right away, his mind elsewhere entirely. He told himself it was nothing, that he was overthinking a lonely woman's odd comment, but the sentence refused to loosen its grip. On the 3rd evening, he came home earlier than usual, walked straight past his own door, and knocked on Eleanor's instead. He half expected her not to answer. Instead, the door opened almost instantly, as though she had been standing on the other side waiting for exactly this. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said, and stepped aside to let him in. Her apartment was nothing like he'd imagined. Warm light spilled from a lamp in the corner. The smell of chamomile tea hung faintly in the air, and every surface held some fragment of a life fully lived. Ceramic birds on the windowsill, a quilt folded over the couch, and photographs. Dozens of them, crowding the walls and the bookshelf and the top of an old upright piano, most of them faded at the edges. He noticed, without quite meaning to, that a startling number of them featured the same young man at different ages, a boy with a gap-toothed grin, then a teenager in a football jersey, then a young man in a cap and gown. Always the same eyes, always the same crooked smile that seemed to sit somewhere between mischief and warmth. The piano, he noticed, had a thin layer of dust across its keys, as if no one had touched it in years, and yet it had clearly been kept, polished, cared for in every other way. Eleanor followed his gaze, and her hand drifted, almost involuntarily, to the frame closest to her chair. She didn't sit right away. She stood there a long moment, and Ethan watched something shift across her face, the careful composure of the woman who ran this building slowly giving way to someone much younger, much more fragile. "That's Daniel," she finally said. "My son." She lowered herself into her chair and gestured for him to sit across from her, and for a while she said nothing else, simply turning her teacup slowly between her palms as though gathering the courage for what came next. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped into something quieter, more careful, like she was handling something breakable. 22 years ago, she told him, Daniel had been driving home from his fiancée's apartment on a rain-slicked road not unlike the one Ethan had walked that very night. A truck crossed the center line. He was 26 years old. Eleanor said the number like it still surprised her. 26, as though some part of her still expected him to walk through the door any day now. Older, tired from work, complaining about traffic. She had kept his room exactly as it was for the first 3 years. It had taken her almost a decade to let herself feel anything resembling ordinary happiness again. Then, 18 months ago, a young man with tired eyes and a moving box full of books had come to look at the vacant unit on the 3rd floor, and something in her chest had cracked open in a way she hadn't expected and couldn't fully explain. It wasn't that Ethan looked exactly like Daniel. It was smaller things, stranger things, the way he ducked his head slightly when he laughed, the way he always thanked her twice, once when she offered something and once again when she handed it over. The way he hummed under his breath while checking his mail, completely unaware he was doing it, a habit Daniel had shared down to the exact tuneless melody. "I told myself I was imagining it," Eleanor said. "For months I told myself that. But then you started stopping by just to talk, and you brought me soup when I had that cold last winter, and you sat with me the night my sister passed, and I stopped being able to pretend. Loving you started to feel less like a choice and more like something that had simply already happened before I noticed." Ethan sat very still, his chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear anymore. He thought about the soup she'd brought him, the evening she'd spent beside him after his father died, without asking a single question. The countless small kindnesses he had accepted without ever once wondering what they cost her or what they gave her in return. He understood finally that her strange words in the lobby hadn't been a warning or a rejection of Claire at all. They had been the truest thing anyone had said to him in years, an old woman admitting, in the only language grief had left her, that somewhere in the last 18 months he had quietly become her family again. "I'm not trying to replace him," Eleanor added quickly, misreading his silence. "I would never ask that of you. I just needed you to understand why I said what I said. It wasn't about jealousy, and it certainly wasn't about that lovely girl you're seeing. It was about love finding its way back into a life that thought it was finished with it." Ethan reached across the small table and took her hand, the way Claire had taken his 3 nights before, except this touch carried an entirely different weight. "You're not replacing anything," he said, "but I wouldn't mind being someone you love anyway. I think I'd like that a lot." For the first time since he'd known her, Eleanor Whitfield cried in front of another person, and she didn't try to hide it. In the weeks that followed, something between them settled into a new and steadier shape. He started leaving his door propped open on Sunday mornings so she could wander in for coffee without knocking. She started leaving notes taped to his mailbox, reminders to eat something green, warnings about ice on the front steps, small, ordinary proofs that someone was thinking of him. Claire, when he finally told her the whole story, cried a little herself and asked if she could meet Eleanor properly, and the 3 of them ended up sharing a slow, unhurried dinner in Eleanor's apartment 2 weekends later, surrounded by photographs of a young man none of them could bring back, But all of them, in their own way, had learned to carry forward. Ethan still thought about that night in the lobby sometimes, the coldness in her voice, the 5 words that had kept him awake for 2 full nights. He understood now that fear and love can sound almost identical when they come from someone terrified of losing what they've only just found again. What had once felt like the strangest sentence anyone had ever said to him had become, in time, one of the kindest. Some families are built by blood, and some are built by a rainy hallway, a closed book, and a woman brave enough to say the truest thing she knew, even when she was certain it might frighten someone away.